Hi everyone, welcome to Mondays with Mel. My name is Melissa Chung-Mowat and I am the NDP candidate running in the federal riding of Winnipeg North. Mondays with Mel is all about connecting with constituents, community, and thought leaders around realities that influence the lives of folks living in Winnipeg North. The theme that we always come back to is all of us together. So I'm really happy to be joined today by Brian Chang. So Brian is not a Winnipeg Norther, but Brian is the NDP candidate running in Toronto Centre. So thanks so much for joining us today, Brian.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. Yes, Toronto Centre is quite far from Winnipeg North, but I'm really excited about the work that you're doing and that other New Democrats are doing right across Manitoba, but especially right in Winnipeg, and it's a lot of fun to watch.
Awesome. Just a couple of interesting facts to share with folks. One, I used to live in Toronto Centre, and so I think that's cool. I know a little
in
bit
my riding,
about,
right? In my riding.
Yeah, exactly. And I know a little bit about the community just through living there and going to Ryerson University while I was doing my master's program there. And when we chatted a couple weeks ago, we both found that we had similar kind of family migration stories in a way. And so your Chinese side actually coming from Jamaica before immigrating to Canada, and on my dad's side, coming from Suriname, South America, and then coming to Canada. So that was cool. That was cool. And that's one thing I love about being able to connect and find those common experiences or shared interests and all of that.
And then that's the cool thing about diversity as well, too, right? Like there are no simple stories. We're complex, interesting people with lots of lived experiences and lived histories and ancestors that have lifted us and really brought us to the point where we're at now. I don't know that my grandparents, when they left Hong Kong and went to Jamaica, and would have thought that at some point their grandson and great grandson would be running for politics in the heart of downtown Toronto in Canada, a country that they weren't even thinking about at the time. So it is interesting to see how that all plays out. But it's really cool to hear that you have that background as well too, because we're cool people.
Very cool. And I think so maybe where we can start, and I think this is really ties in really nicely around, I thought maybe you could share a bit about what inspired you to get involved in politics, and yeah, kind of your why, because I read a little bit about it, but I think it's really a great message.
So I've been involved in politics for a long time. I think I've always thought about the ways that I wanted to interact with the world and see problems that I want to make better. And a lot of that comes from just staying involved and making sure that I'm being in spaces. So right now, what's in the news that I've been paying attention to is actually the deforestation that's happening of old growth forest on the southwestern shore of Vancouver Island right now. And what we're seeing are 100-year-old, like hundreds of years old, old growth forests being cut down and destroyed, and that's wrong. And I actually was thinking about it today, that one of the formative kind of issues that I got involved in was in high school. At the age of 14 or 15, I got involved with Greenpeace. And at the time, we were running a campaign called Clear Cut, which was a play on Kleenex. And I used to go around with this big sign that said, it takes 90 years to grow a roll of toilet paper. And we were trying to get pressure on these corporations to adopt sustainable forestry practices and not to be clear cutting old growth forest in both in the boreal of Northern Ontario, and then of course in BC on the island, as well as the interior. And it's issues like that continue to stand with me. And it's bizarre to me that we're still cutting down old growth forest for disposable products in this day and age. And it's things like that where we have to really think about, where have we not made improvements over time? And that issue could be housing, that issue can be education, that issue can be issue can be healthcare. There's so much work that needs to be done in our communities. And I'm continuing to fight for what we need in Toronto Centre to make sure that we don't get further behind.
Yeah, and I think with so many of these issues, whether it's around environmental justice or social justice, workers' rights, there's so much overlap and connection between all of these causes that brings these efforts together in the work that we're trying to do.
And they're largely the same battle for me, that the battle for climate justice goes hand in hand with racial justice. You cannot have one without the other. And the way that environmental racism expresses itself, especially in a country like Canada, where Indigenous peoples and Black communities and poor communities suffer disproportionately as a result of systemic choices made by governments time and time again.
Yeah.
And that's something that's not okay. And one other piece that I always think about as well too is that when I was 1 year old in 1988, the government of Canada passed a unanimous motion saying that they would end child poverty by the year 2000, and that was called the Campaign 2000 Pledge. And Campaign 2000 still exists. Because and environmental and NGOs are still working on that across Canada, because child poverty is not any better in Canada over the course of my lifetime, and that's simply unacceptable.
Yeah, and I think, in Winnipeg North, there's tons of grassroots work happening around because we have a real child poverty problem here in Manitoba and in Winnipeg North as well. And yeah, these are long-standing issues that we don't have any more time to waste on these long-term promises. We need action on them, right? And so,
Yeah.
And when it comes to the environmental racism part, you can look at natural disasters or the current pandemic we're in. And these things, although they seem out of our control, they definitely impact, racialized folks, people living in poverty at a way higher rate. And so it's not just a neutral issue, right? It's an issue around, it's a social justice issue. It's all of that.
And for child poverty, if we break it down kind of by riding, and ridings are a weird artificial way of breaking up communities, because it's not like something changes just because you cross the street. A lot of the issues continue across streets, across rivers, or whatever artificial boundary kind of is set up. But the Toronto Centre actually has the second highest level of child poverty in the entire country. In this riding, in the heart of Toronto, and if people have ever been here, it's where the Eaton Centre is, it's where Yonge and Dundas Square is, it's where Maple Leaf Gardens is. There are 100,000, it's the smallest geographic riding in the entire country. It's 10 square kilometers, but there are over 100,000 people that live in this riding. And I think, and when you think of child poverty, people aren't often thinking about just literally in the shadow of skyscrapers of the biggest banks and the biggest corporations in Canada, literally in the shadow of these corporations that control so much money, that are getting so much money from the government, that are getting so much of our taxpayer money and are getting so much more support. Meanwhile, there are children on the street, and there are communities that are struggling. There are encampments that need access and support. There is an opioid crisis that is at play in our communities. There are people crammed into rooming houses because they can't afford anywhere else that's safer. There are so many issues that are at play here in Toronto Centre, and I think that they're an issue right across the country, because if this can happen in the heart of our most wealthy city and the biggest city, it can happen anywhere in Canada. And people have to realize that we really have to hold those who are already elected to account for this track record, this abysmal track record. And if not, then we need to replace them. And I think that's what you and I are stepping up to do in our communities, to replace people who are actually in the way of the progress that we need to make lives better for everyday Canadians.
Yeah, and I think, in Winnipeg North, like you said, these are issues across Canada, and in Winnipeg North too, they're really amplified. And so we have deep issues that we've had here for a long time. We have incredible community strength, but we also have what appears to be not very much will to actually tackle these big issues in an urgent way that they should be. And I think that, maybe if you want to touch a little bit on this, and to tie it a bit into representation in politics and the strength that having, multiple, and diverse lived experiences at the table to help inform policy, because it's coming from and being in these communities that you can really truly understand the needs and the strengths, and how urgent we need leaders to be there to address these issues. And so can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I identify as a Chinese Jamaican queer man who lives with a facial difference, and I encourage anybody to Google facial difference. It's a term that we use in the disability community to describe anybody with a disability, acquired or congenital, from the neck upwards. And so from the disabled standpoint, I can understand the struggles. I'm functional. I'm able to participate in the job market. I'm able to do that work, but many people who are disabled aren't able to do that work. As a racialized person, I know the weight of when the color of your skin speaks before you even open your mouth, and what that means in terms of people and their ability to take you credibly, the kind of treatment you get, the denial of service, or the service that you might get from people depending where you are. And that has become an issue, especially as a result of COVID racism and the rise of anti-Asian hate that's happening in our communities right now. As a queer person, especially in Toronto Centre, is home to the largest queer community and in Canada, and the village is the Church Wellesley Village is right in the heart of my community. And to go back to that environmental racism piece we were talking about as well too, almost every other postal code in Ontario, in Toronto surrounding the village, was considered a hotspot by the provincial government here. So they had priority access to vaccines, and the village was left out. And that is a really weird thing because, again, like I said, it doesn't change because you cross the street. Like literally, if you were to cross the street in that direction, one street in that direction, you would be in a hotspot and you would have been eligible for a vaccine. It also ties into housing. Like the HIV crisis hit this community very hard. There are actually buildings, high-rise apartments and smaller buildings and such that were built at a time to house specifically people who were infected with HIV. And during the late 80s and the early 90s, those houses, they weren't proper homes. They were built as rooming houses, basically, with a shared bathroom. They had a small kitchen, if a kitchen at all. But people were surviving HIV. But those buildings still exist, which means that there's housing that's inadequate for people. They weren't meant to be there for an extended period of time. And it's inadequate for people's needs now, but that's the kind of housing that they're stuck in because they can't go anywhere else. They can't find anything else to be able to afford if they want to stay in these particular communities. So there's so many intersections of my identity. And I did a lot of work with AIDS service organizations in downtown Toronto. There's one called Asian Community AIDS Services, which is so important to how I have grown up as a person and part of my advocacy work as well too. And I sat on their board of directors, and that the HIV crisis is still one that we need to pay attention to. And it's also tied to access to pharmacare and why it's so important, because we're still having so many issues with people who aren't able to get all of the medications that they need. It is tied to issues like immigration and whether people who are coming to Canada or are waiting on status in Canada and become infected with the virus. There are complications, there are legal implications, and there are other problems as well too for perfectly healthy people and gay men who are not infected, who do not have risky behaviors, who are unable to give blood, for example, as well too. So there are so many parts of my identity that are just front and center in the issues that are going on in the riding, and I can't turn away from that, right? Like it's the people I love, it's my friends, it's my family, and I think that's what we need in elected representation. People who actually come from our communities and give a damn about them, because this isn't stuff that we can just sweep under the table and pretend like it's not a problem. These are people's lives, and we need to do better.
Yeah, and I think too, it's not just about not being able to turn away, but also that there's great strength in being able to understand the complexity of these issues, because it's not as easy as one program or one change to this policy. A lot of this takes a whole systems view, and when you can bring those multiple perspectives to the table and see how complex these issues are, and the real, we're going to need real bold and progressive policies and programs in place to address the multitude of things that people face in our community. And so I think, it's such a gift to be able to bring that perspective and that understanding to really truly have that broad understanding of what's happening in our communities and the kind of change that we need to see.
And I think it's important for people to recognize as well too that their elected representatives, whether be they liberal, conservatives, that they might, sometimes the worst thing that you can do to your community is not even know that there's an issue and not even pay attention to it. And I think that that's what we're dealing with. We have never had a queer representative federally here, which means that if you need to teach an elected representative what it means that the HIV crisis is still a thing, that the opioid crisis is still a thing, that people can't afford homes in our community and they're leaving, that elders are dying on the street because they do not have access to adequate housing. If you need to, if you don't have elected representatives who are willing, who see that, who are in the community and get it, that's really, really dangerous. And that's often what I think is the worst part of politics, is not when people choose to speak up, it's actually when people don't even know that there's an issue. So they don't even try, it's off their radar, it's an unknown unknown. And as a result of that, people continue to fall through the cracks time and time again. And that's simply, it's not okay. And it's one of the reasons why I'm continuing to step up and why I'm out there in the community every day, because this is, it's worth fighting for. People are worth fighting for every single time.
Well, I just want to say that from a personal standpoint, this is my first time entering into politics, and it makes a big difference for me as a biracial, Indigenous, and Chinese woman to have folks like yourself to so that I can know that we can do this work. There is space for us. And there's so many people creating that space, and there's so much value in the work that we're doing, and we just keep pushing on. And so thank you for being one of those folks that is giving me inspiration to take this step forward. And so,
oh my, that's a lot of, I was super inspired when you ran, and it's one of the reasons why I reached out as well too, because it does mean a lot to see people who look like us, who talk like us, are talking about the issues that are important to us, that have similar backgrounds, that give a damn about our community out there. And you can tell that. You can tell when there's a new Democrat, and you can tell when there's a liberal, and you can tell when there's a conservative, and when they're talking about their communities, because the way we talk about our communities is so different. And I've heard that in the way that you talked about your community as well too, and the advocacy and the importance that matters. So I see myself reflected in you, and that gives me a lot of strength to know that yes, we're in the right party, and I think we're doing, the work is hard, absolutely, both in the party and outside of the party, but it's absolutely worth doing.
And this is how we build the movement.
Absolutely.
So thanks, Brian. I feel like we could talk for way longer, and so just quickly, and your video is frozen, but that's okay. We can hear you okay. Just quickly, we end on one note. Which is why, and you know what, I feel like you've answered this already, but if you have a quick little soundbite for us, why is your community important to you, and how do we work together to build on its strengths?
Toronto Centre is a working class community, and I think people need to, I always think it's really important for people to identify as working class, that it is valuable to be a worker. It is valuable to know that your labor contributes to something bigger. It is valuable to know as well too that people are exploiting your labor and not paying you enough, and not giving you health and benefits, and not giving you vacation time and paid holidays and all the things that you deserve. And people should embrace that, because it means that there are things worth fighting for, and it means that there are tons of other workers, I guarantee you, that are fighting back as well too. So Toronto Centre is a working class community like so many others across the country, and I want to make sure that we're doing everything that we can to empower workers, because workers make everything work.
Amazing. There's so many commonalities, and so I'm so excited to run alongside you, Brian. Thank you
The
so much
same.
for joining us today. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, and we will see you next week. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.